runoff results. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for PAAT's post-runoff power hour, where this is a timely conversation about the Texas primary runoff results. And we're looking forward to this discussion today and what we're interested in knowing about what it may mean heading into the general election and the 90th legislative session. We have more than 100 people registered, and so it's clear that this topic is generating a lot of interest, and we're glad to welcome you. We're welcome to our outstanding panel of experts and longtime observers of Texas politics: Jim Henson, Gromer Jeffers, Harvey Kronberg, Mark Jones, and Brad Johnson. Before I turn things over to Jim to moderate, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes, as always. First, questions are welcome. Please submit them anytime using the chat or the Q&A function. We'll get to as many as we can. Second, today's program, for those of you who are lawyers, today's program has been approved by the State Bar of Texas for 1 hour of participatory continuing legal education credit. That form is posted on the chat, and we'll send it out following the webinar also. Thirdly, thanks to our PAAT members for supporting PAAT for nearly 25 years. PAAT has stood for integrity and professionalism in public policy advocacy. If you're interested in membership, please contact me or the PAAT website. You can contact us, and we'll share more information on the chat. As I said, most of you know our panelists, but briefly, Jim Henson directs the Texas Politics Project. Gromer Jeffers is the political writer for the Dallas Morning News. Harvey Kronberg leads the Powerhouse Quorum Report. And Mark Jones is a professor of political science and a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And so thanks very much to all of you for joining us and being part of the PAAT team for this program. So I'll turn it over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back. Happy to be here with everybody. And I can't see. There's Mark. Okay. Just adjusting my thing to make sure I couldn't see Mark. Hey, Mark. So everybody, let's just start. We know that this has obviously been a marquee race nationally. Tom was talking about doing some reading about the race. If he's read everything, my hat's off to him because it's sort of everywhere. I kind of want to jump beyond that a little bit and ask all of you to, start with your personal headline. Like, what do you really think is the biggest takeaway from this race, beyond the fact that Paxton won and won by a lot? Harvey, I'm going to start with you.
I think my headline would be Christian nationalist move from controlling the convention to moving to controlling the slate.
It's a long headline, but so tell us a little more about what you mean by that.
Well, just looking up and down the ballot, it's all cultural, with the exception of Greg Abbott, who we're not really sure what he believes. Everybody else on the Republican side is got deep roots in Christian nationalism, and of course, Beau French being the marquee character running against Sharia law, Mays Middleton running against Sharia law, and boys and girls bathrooms. It is has no resemblance to the old conservative arguments, pro-business arguments that once characterized the Republican Party. Now it's essentially internally all cultural warfare. The state Republican convention is going to be a victory lap for the Tim Dunns of the
world. Brad, what do you think? Well, how about you?
The Senate race ended up where it began when Ken Paxton jumped in, which was him in first place.
Okay, I think we're going to come back to internal dynamics. I'm going to let you elaborate that in the next round. Gromer?
MAGA and Democrats got what they wanted. If you look at the results, Ken Paxton won, Mays Middleton, Beau French, and these are all the candidates that Democrats, if they had to choose, would want to run against. I mean, so we will see what happens yet again. This will be yet another test of where we are in Texas politics, because you can argue if Democrats can't beat this slate in this environment, and that will tell you something. But it offers openings uh, for not just maybe winning these high profile races, but creating some down ballot carnage for Republicans, just as you saw in 2018.
Now, there's a lot to plow into there. Mark, how about you?
I think, I guess one thing is the electability argument for November doesn't resonate among the Republican primary electorate. The Cornyn campaign spent and his supporters spent tens of millions of dollars trying to make that argument, and it had no success. And when you go to races like railroad commissioner or even attorney general, the Republican primary electorate is not persuaded that any Republican isn't persuaded by the argument that this Republican could cost us the election in November. That just doesn't seem to work. After years of success, there's maybe some hubris or a belief that at the end of the day, Republicans will all rally around, voters will rally around the Republican candidate, warts and all, and hold their nose if necessary. And then just related to that is, Donald Trump's endorsement still carries a lot of weight within the Republican primary electorate. He may be a liability in the general election. I think he is, definitely. But in the Republican primary, he still is a real asset.
Mark, I want to stick with you. I want to set up, and I'll go back down the line on this. But, I want to talk about, we're drawing a lot of conclusions, I think, about the Republican Party based on a relatively small group of voters. Now, we always do that, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about that. But I am curious whether you and the other panelists think, my question, direct question, how representative is what happened in the dynamic between the primary and particularly the runoff of what's going on in the overall Republican Party? And obviously its implications that you kind of nodded to in terms of the general election environment. But for the moment, I mean, does it make sense to take, how representative is this of what we think is going on in the electoral base of the Republican Party?
Well, so, primary voters are a small fraction. We're talking, just shy of 1.4 million people turned out. That's like what, 7%? Very small proportion of the overall electorate. It's a small proportion of the people who actually vote Republican. But it's the group that's driven the train for the past, decades in terms of where the Republican Party exists when it runs candidates in November. And the ask to the rest of the Republican voters who clearly aren't as committed and aren't as interested because they didn't bother to turn out in the primary. What they're faced with every November is, this is what you get from the primary. Do you prefer this, or do you prefer what the Democrats are offering, or do you prefer to stay home? And since 1996, in statewide races, the answer of those November voters has always been, we're going to go with the Republican option. What Democrats are banking on this cycle is that because of Donald Trump's very low approval ratings that continue to decline, Republicans nominating a deeply flawed candidate with Ken Paxton, and Democrats having at least a decent candidate with James Talrico, that this year may be different. And it'll be up to those November voters who, I think, probably, at least from a surveying perspective, they don't like where the Republican Party is going, but they aren't convinced that the Democrats have the answer either.
Yeah. Gromer, what's your sense of this? I mean, look, I think there's been a certain tendency to kind of over elaborate or announce with great drama the kind of obvious, which is, this is where the Republican Party is right now. But I mean, what's your read of how this carries over moving forward, and how you define the Republican Party?
Yeah, it is perplexing to me that with so much at stake, you'll see a 7 to 8% turnout when one of the the great champions of the traditional Republican Party, traditional conservatives in Texas. His career is on the line, and the supporters don't bother to try to save him, at least in the second round. This is a general election voting state, almost on both sides, right? Well, really on both sides.
Yeah.
And so Mark is right. There's a feeling among a lot of Texas Republicans, even those who don't vote in the primaries, that I will vote for anything that doesn't have, or anybody that doesn't have a D next to their name. And that's the challenge for Democrats, is to develop a candidate that can break through all of that. And we saw it with Beto O'Rourke, who was largely undefined in 2018. And Republicans have seemingly have learned that lesson. The question is, can Talarico stand up to the assault that they're going to put on him for all kinds of like social issues that seemingly aren't as important in terms of the largest scheme of things, like the economy, but have great resonance with Republican voters, not just the primary voters, but also general election voters. So how will all this stuff that they're throwing at Talarico play in November?
Yeah, I want to touch on that, but I want to come back to that a little bit on
Yeah.
the Talarico definition contest, because I think
Yeah.
it's pretty critical. Brad, I don't want to be unfair to you, but you have and I mean this in a positive way. You're kind of a Republican whisperer, party or brand here. And I'm thinking back to when we did the PAT event at the Otis back in the fall, and you were comparing Republican divisions to Democratic divisions. So what's your read of like where the Republican Party is, how much we can extrapolate from this election?
Well, we're certainly seeing a philosophical shift in the Republican Party. Um, I would say it's gone from more institutionalist to more populist, and that's not to say that there's no room for institutionalists in the current state of the Republican Party, but clearly there's less and less. And one of the foremost institutionalists in Texas just got ousted. So. Um, I think you also have to view it in the context of there's been a lot of just general displeasure on the more active voter base of the right with Cornyn himself. I mean, he got booed on the Republican Party of Texas convention stage in 2022 after he pushed forward the gun reform bill following the Uvalde massacre. There's that. There's various other things over the years where eventually the kinds of people that turn out in runoffs became less and less enthusiastic with John Cornyn as a candidate. I think you also have to add to the fact that Paxton was a unique challenger in this regard, and unique in how much dirt there was to say about him, but also unique in the fact that it didn't really matter in the end. He's kind of the state's Teflon Don. The Republicans, especially the more establishment types, have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at him, and he's still standing. And he is, despite James Talarico's candidacy and Democratic hopes in November, he's the odds-on favorite to be the next U.S. senator from Texas. So there's a lot there to it, but generally it all goes back to this shift in what Republicans believe in their core, and it's becoming more and more populist. And there's many different reasons why that's developed, but I think overall it's the fact that Republicans, particularly those conservatives, however we define that now, got tired of losing, and whether they were actually losing or not is a different issue entirely. But they decided that they had been losing, and that changed the way they think about politics, and it ultimately spelled the doom for John Cornyn and his type of republicanism, his type of conservatism. I asked Cornyn, along with Rick Perry and Phil Gramm at the San Antonio event last week, whether this was a referendum on their kind of republicanism. They kind of dismissed it. They said, "I don't think that's the case. That's kind of a phony proposition." But I think clearly it is a pretty clear dynamic change right now, at least in terms of the kind of voters that turn out in a runoff. So, it's a different Republican Party than the one that took over the states in 2003.
I think that's a perfect setup for Harvey's sort of characterization of the party when he started from his headline. But I want to stick with you for 1 second because I can't help but ask. I mean, there's an interesting tension, I think, between this read of what's going on in the base of the Republican Party as kind of anti-institutionalist and the nominal head of the state party being Greg Abbott, who has done more than any other governor, in my view, to build the institutional power of state government vis-a-vis other actors.
Except, and I know that's for Brad, but let me just jump in here real quick.
Please.
Cornyn was a federal official, and it's always harder for people in Congress or in the House or Senate. Remember Kay Bailey Hutchinson's race against Rick Perry. There's a hatred for the federal government that Abbott and Paxton and folks in Texas benefit from. But sorry, Brad, go ahead.
No, I agree with that. It's a different calculus. Just look at the debate over the U.S. Senate and whether it's currently a worthwhile institution as far as many Republicans think right now. And the guiding force in the Republican Party is Donald Trump, and he says the Senate sucks at the moment because nothing he wants is getting done now. Again, that is a very simplistic explanation for it, but we're not dealing in nuanced times right now. We're not carefully debating property tax rates or whatnot. It's all team sport, and so in a lot of voters' views, the Senate is just a useless institution at the moment. I think that crosses multiple political boundaries. I don't think that's just a conservative Republican viewpoint. I think if you polled the average voter on whether they would just choose to oust every single senator or even the ones they like, including the ones they don't like, I think they'd probably just hit the button and say, yes, do it. A buddy of mine and I were talking about that last night, and I think it's pretty clear. You see John Cornyn getting ousted. You see Bill Cassidy in Louisiana. I'm sure we'll have a couple others by the time we get to the November election, but it is a clear anti-establishment, anti-incumbent flavor right now, and that helps people like Paxton, of course, and I think there's something to be said about that being maybe a uniquely federal dynamic, but we just saw a bunch of incumbents get ousted in the Texas House.
Although the exception to that being Trump himself, though, who's still at 80% Republican approval.
Well, I don't think people really view him as an incumbent or establishment, as crazy as that is, because he is obviously the Republican establishment. I don't think Republican voters really view it that way. They still view him as the guy who's shaking things up and taking it to the old guard. And he just took out John Cornyn. I think it raises another point about this result. The Cornyn team felt good. They didn't feel like they had above 50% chance of winning this thing, but they felt good about their data and the voters they were targeting until the Trump endorsement came down, and then you had people that they had been tracking as either Cornyn voters in the primary or surefire Cornyn voters in the runoff flip and go with Ken Paxton because of the Trump endorsement. I don't think we can spill enough ink on how formidable that was.
Harvey?
I'm going to kind of toss a question to our pollsters, you, Jim and Mark. Nationally, the fastest growing political alignment appears to be independents, self-identified independents, suggesting that people who are calling themselves Republican are shrinking in number. I don't know if that metric is the same in Texas, but the question: November Republicans typically come back home, but as Brad said, it's a team sport now, and the question is the team shrinking? And if you look at Tarrant County and Fort Bend County and even Collin County, they're all increasingly purple, mixed populations that are under assault by arguably Republican rhetoric. And it seems to me that Republican populist loyalty is intense, but but the absolute number, the base vote that we rely on historically is a shrinking number.
Yeah, but you're saying that nationally, you think that's happening here?
I'm wondering if that's happening here.
Yeah,
One time I asked you what you do follow-up questions on independent vote. You said it's
yeah.
12%. We know 12% generally break Republican. Largely, that I would argue has a lot to do with the lack of democratic messaging or ability to message. But I'm just wondering if that 12% might be expanding in Texas.
Yeah, I suspect not, but we shall see.
Yeah.
I want to go, and broaden
just
the
one.
discussion a little bit to the state races and talk a little bit about what stuck out. I mean, obviously, I think I don't know how surprising it was, but the headline there, it seems to me, or the most unexpected or striking result was Beau French winning that railroad election, that railroad commission election, the runoff. Well, what should we make? Should we make too much? Can we make too much of that? Could we make too little of that? Who wants to jump in? I'm just going to let whoever.
I'll
Well,
just
no, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I was just going to say the macro level is the ever shrinking presence of Greg Abbott as a dominant force in electoral politics. Dan Patrick except for that, had a pretty good night. When everything is said and done, Greg Abbott won what, 8 seats. That was the biggest shadow he cast in the Republican primaries.
Gromer, what were you were gonna jump in on that?
Yeah, that one has the ability to cause problems for Republicans uh, on the on down ballot, I believe. Beau French is from Tarrant County. Tarrant County is a bit of a battleground. You're going to have a really intense county judge race there between the incumbent Tim O'Hara and and um and so it will be interesting to see if that and other things that Harvey has pointed out, sort of the assault on I mean, some of the immigrant communities feel like they've been targeted. And so if you go to like in places like North Texas and Harris County and where you have pockets of, say, Indian voters or just immigrants from all over that are in these thriving communities, you keep clipping away at the margins like that, and maybe you can make something out of it if you're a Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing with French, a lot will depend on what type of campaign he runs and what type of campaign sort of Republicans have around him. If he adopts the Ken Paxton strategy of, say, 2018 or 2022, which is effectively go to ground, stay out of the headlines, and essentially just ride Greg Abbott's coattails to victory, John Rosenthal is not a force to be reckoned with by any stretch of the imagination. He's not going to have much luck raising money, and so if French just plays it smart, and if the Sharia law, I mean, he has an extremist background going back many years, but if he can tone that down and effectively just be a Republican candidate and avoid saying things that are too controversial between now and November, uh, that's far enough down ballot where the Republican wave that still will exist should carry him to victory. If, on the other hand, he decides he wants to be the center of attention and wants to continue on the Sharia law crusade and make anti-Semitic remarks and do a lot of things that have alienated people, then he could be trouble. I assume. I mean, but once again, rational or whatever the rational pragmatic decision isn't necessarily the one that wins the day in the Republican Party these days. But if it is, he should be able to just sort of disappear. And even Republican primary voters didn't really know who these candidates were all that much. And I think one thing that probably doomed Jim Wright, at least from our polling in that primary, was that the fact that once Trump endorsed Cornyn, if that had any deflation effect on Cornyn supporters turning out to vote, those were heavily Jim Wright voters. That is, people who supported Cornyn also are much more likely to support Jim Wright. Any drop in the Cornyn turnout, which I think some of the explanation for why Paxton won by such a large margin is that some former Cornyn voters went to Paxton, but that it also is some Cornyn voters simply stayed home. And those Cornyn voters who stayed home would have, by almost 2-to-1 margin voted for Jim Wright over Beau French, perhaps even larger than that.
You know, we had a couple of it's come up a couple of times. I want to pivot just a little bit. I think it was
Jim, can I add
yeah,
something to
yeah,
that?
please. Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
I think the flip side of what Mark just said is that, we also saw, I think, some down ballot poll from Paxton for Middleton and Beau French. Paxton, from what I saw, didn't come out and officially endorse either candidate. He did say in a recording that was then blasted around everywhere that he supports Middleton in that contest. He was also touring with French. So the support was implied, if not outright stated. And then, you get the Paxton having the boost from the Trump endorsement. I think that went down ticket some. Going into the race, the AG, both camps of the AG race thought this was going to be a nail biter. And so it could have gone either way. And then you have Trump coming in for Paxton, Paxton supporting Middleton, the link made to Paxton, and that pulls Middleton up 10 points. And I think that probably saved, given how tight the margins were, Beau French in this campaign because he was tying himself to Paxton as well. And French was way outspent by Jim Wright. So it kind of tracks that something had to kind of bail him out of that. And I think it was the Paxton poll in this particular electorate because, this wasn't the primary electorate as we've talked about. It was substantially smaller.
Um, there's a couple directions we can go with that. I want to come back to something on that. I mean, I would just add to that very quickly. It seems like in a lot of ways, well, the Trump endorsement obviously had an impact. It was kind of a pro-cyclical impact for most of the candidates other than French, to put what you're saying a slightly different way. Otherwise, I think absent the Trump endorsement, the first place finishers would probably not look very different other than French. But that it was a push in a direction that was already going, which is very Trumpian, right? Um, I kind of want to focus a little bit on what's going on in the building in the Capitol. And I am noticing I see the questions, Allison, and I'll work them in. You know, as I was saying before, we went back to this. I think it was Harvey, a couple of you already mentioned the kind of Abbott Patrick. I want to kind of looming and who did better in this and whatever. And I kind of want to come back to that and kind of explore that just a little bit. In other words, for this audience, what does this mean for what's going on in the Capitol complex? Clear winners, clear losers, impact on the mood of the legislature as we move through these interim hearings, which have been very active. And there's been a lot of, not headline interesting things going on, but interesting things going on in some of these committee hearings in terms of what people are focusing on. But allowing for the fact that the big fallout won't come till we see what happens in the general election. For now, what's the fallout? Do people share? I mean, I'm a little skeptical. I'll just say it. Harvey's kind of characterization of the incredible shrinking governor. I think that actually, as we move into the general election, the governor is going to loom a little larger. But I'm curious what people think of how this affects the lay of the land in the operational circles of state government in the interim,
Let
if
me
at
just
all.
let me just build out on my concept, and that is, I think that Abbott's control of the administrative state is near absolute, and Patrick's control of the electoral based state is near complete. So they have two competing universes from which they operate, and I don't think there's any doubt inside the building that Patrick has more impact as long as the Republicans have this kind of majority than Greg Abbott. On his property tax proposal, for instance, he's threatening to go after folks in the next primary if they don't fall in line. But we'll find out if somebody like Jeff Yass gives him $10 million to run negative ads on Republican incumbents. The biggest impact of his last effort was that he disenfranchised TLR and created a bunch of pro-trial lawyer Republicans.
I guess I would say I would point on Abbott. Abbott, I think, is going to become very valuable or important for Texas Republicans, though, because just like back in 2020, where they really needed someone to be sort of the key player, the principal, taking responsibility for running a more statewide campaign that wasn't candidate centric, I think that responsibility is going to fall to Abbott. He clearly has the best campaign operation, has the best infrastructure, has the best knowledge, has the best people, has the most money. He's in a unique position to do that for a November election in a way that Patrick doesn't have that ability. And I'm not sure the Paxton campaign can be trusted to do that on their own. I mean, and there's going to, and most of the Paxton monies, I think it's going to, that's going to be super PAC money coming in, simply attacking James Tallarico. There needs to be other money out there driving turnout, targeting voters. And that's something that I think Greg Abbott's in a unique position to do. And he's perhaps the only one right now, at least, that has that organization and ability to target those Republican voters who, at the margins, they're going to need to win both the Senate race as well as the other down ballot races and not suffer negative consequences in the legislature. And that's something we could talk about, as we, maybe in the next segment is, sort of what this Tallarico candidacy means for the Texas House in particular. Texas Senate, whatever. Those districts are drawn so rock solid that, Dan Patrick can control that even if the Republicans lose every statewide office. Well, except, obviously, Lieutenant Governor wouldn't want to lose that.
Yeah, Mark, Abbott performed that role in 2018 when he had a real field program and a bad candidate to run against, Lupe Valdez, the former Dallas County Sheriff. He really helped Ted Cruz in that race, Cruz's race against Beto O'Rourke. And I will add, in the Capitol, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Texas Republican Party priorities, legislative priorities, and what the hardline conservatives decide what their priorities are, because this primary is another sort of warning shot that, hey, if you guys don't circle around our agenda, we will meet you again at the ballot box.
Red, what do you think? I mean, do some people get to walk taller for a little bit as a result of yesterday in the Capitol, or is it still too ephemeral?
Yeah, certainly the right flank of the party is feeling really good about itself, and it should. They've gained a lot of ground since they first started kind of laying siege to the Capitol, politically, of course, but yeah, not
here, yeah,
not physically,
yeah.
like
no, I think it's good
Congress.
that you make that distinction, given. Yeah.
So in my mind, the biggest stakes here, it's not one Senate seat. One Senate seat is probably not going to decide who controls the Senate next year. It's more of a symbolic thing. The real stakes at play are the Texas House, and obviously the biggest effect Beto O'Rourke had was the 12 seats in the Texas House that they gained. In the Senate, even if Governor Abbott has told donors, we could see 2 state Senate seats lost, 2 statewide seats lost. There's some shrugging off of that's he's just using that to get to shake pocketbooks loose more, which I'm sure there's something to that. But I think he does honestly believe, and sense I'm getting from all the consultants is that they do honestly believe this could be a disaster. Not necessarily will be, but it could be. In the Senate, they can just change the rules to change the supermajority line. So that's not really, even if they lose 2 seats, that's not really that that's formidable in terms of consequences for next year. But if they lose 8 seats in the Texas House, that drops the majority to 80. That's a 4-seat majority, 4 or 5 seat. But that significantly changes the calculus on speaker politics, but also the way lawmakers plan for and address next session with policy. If the majority drops that much, odds are what's going to be passed in terms of the RPT priorities next month, the legislative priorities, especially if it goes the way it's sounding right now, it's it's going to be dead on arrival, just like it was in 2019 when
I was gonna say that's
Republicans.
where the 2018, 2019 comparison is
Yeah.
kind of fruitful.
So and if that happens, does that set up more enmity between the grassroots right and the lawmakers in the Capitol? Does that set up another, really contentious primary next year in 28? It all comes for me, it comes back to the Texas House, and that is kind of the linchpin for what all of us on this call are going to be watching carefully next session.
Well, that's a good transition into what Mark was suggesting, which I wanted to do, which is so talk a little bit. What'd you have in mind in terms of down ballot in the House, Mark?
Well, I like to think of it in sort of tranches. So there's the most vulnerable tranche. So the people that are probably dead women and dead men walking, the Denise Villalobos, Janie Lopez, perhaps, John Lujan's replacement. Those are tough seats to hold in a non-good Republican year, and I don't think 2026 is going to be that. Then you have another tier where it starts getting into Angie Chen Button, Morgan Meyer. And then I think from what sort of what Brad's alluding to is then that next tier, if things start to really go bad, then people like Lacey Hull, Mano de Ayala, Mike Schofield here in Houston, Brad Buckley, uh, Caroline Harris Davila, all of them start to go into that tier, and that's where you go. Going from 88 to 85, that's clearly manageable. That's that I don't think that would be seen as too much of a shift. And the Villalobos seat was a gift seat. No one really expected. That was sort of a surprise. And the Lujan seat and the Lopez seats are ones that people know are always tenuous. But once you start going from fat to bone marrow, that's where it starts to get dangerous. And that's where I think the fear of if there's a Tallarico wave, it's that next layer of people who start to become vulnerable, particularly people who are in districts where the number of white college educated voters that tend to sort of go both ways in terms of Republicans, and some of those independents that we were talking about earlier, or Republican leaning independents, may be willing to cross the line, or they may stay home. And that's where we start getting down into the 70s for the Republican caucus.
I just want to, I mean, when you say a Tallarico wave, there could be a Tallarico wave and Tallarico could still lose, right?
Right. That's what happened to Beto. I mean, there was a
Beto,
wave.
Yeah.
Everybody benefited from it except for Beto.
Yeah.
Sorry, Grandma, go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I was saying yes. I agree.
The the thing we have to, I think, at least mention is candidate quality still matters down ballot. And in 2018, Democrats had a lot of good candidate quality, one of which is now the top of the ticket for U.S. Senate. Um, Democrats did something good for themselves this time in that they fielded challengers to every single Republican up and down the ticket. But if you look closer at some of these candidates, the Villalobos one comes to mind. The candidate quality is not that good. And maybe it doesn't matter because that seat is still lean Democrat in terms of the partisan leaning. But Villalobos is a really good candidate for her district, and she brought back a lot of stuff legislatively last session for Corpus Christi. Although the water situation is quite
She did a lot of things, but she wasn't carrying their water.
yeah, right. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's generic Republican never goes up against generic Democrat ultimately, and so the conditions can be there, but if these Democratic candidates they fielded against challengers suck, then they're going to have a lower hit rate than they would otherwise have. So,
No, I mean that's the advantage that say Lacey Hull, Mike Schofield, Mano de Ayala have is they are strong candidates and their opponents aren't that great. It's more the wave factor where people are
yeah.
If we go back to say 2010, or the 2010 election where it didn't really matter in a lot of those East Texas Democratic seats. It was just I mean it was just if there was an R next to your name.
I just
Yeah,
want to
and
go ahead, Dave.
2008 was a wave that favored Democrats, the Obama wave. Remember it?
Well,
They came within 2 seats of taking the House. One quick point: straight ticket voting is gone, so it will be tougher for down ballot candidates to benefit on a pure party vote.
There's a question in here that touches on this. I just want to start knocking a couple of these out. And the question is in the context of the dead men walking, quote unquote, argument. How does the 2-to-1 vote for Paxton along the border counties factor into this discussion?
Well, I mean, he won the 2-to-1 vote, but not that many people voted.
Yeah.
So, it's like proportionally he did quite well, but and that's the group that's shifted in terms, Donald Trump's 55% among Texas Latinos was always going to be illusory. That was a combination of support for Trump, opposition and dissatisfaction with the Biden administration, and dislike of Kamala Harris. It was always you're never going to be able to obtain that 55%. And if the border just starts to go back to more the sort of 60-40, then as long as Democrats nominate decent candidates, then they should be in much better shape. That is, when it's always probabilistic. That is, people are vulnerable. You always have one or two vulnerable people who survive and one or two non-vulnerable people who lose. But on average, it's just, the Villalobos seat, the Lujan seat, and the Lopez seat are just tough ones for any Republican to hold. They're in a good Republican year, they're Republican seats, but in a bad Republican year, then the gap, they're going to have to outperform the generic Republican or the average Republican by a substantial mid to high single digit margin.
Well, somebody, actually Tom Forbes had asked about that we touch on this, so I think it's a good point to say, and in terms of the dynamic of the Latino vote, I mean, I agree with Mark, and I think this is becoming more clear to anybody looking at the data that, 2024 was a pretty unusual high watermark. I would add the economy as an issue to Mark's list of factors there. But most of the polling data shows that Latinos are reverting a little bit closer to the expected range, probably a slightly higher baseline for Republicans than we saw before. But if you look at things like Trump approval, issue approvals, what the most important problem is, Latinos are kind of not looking nearly as Republican inclined. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that we're having to accept what I think a lot of academics have kind of played with for a while. And that's the fact that there's a band of Latinos for whom, and it's a pretty wide band, I think a comparatively wide band compared to some other ethnic groups, whose party identification and voting behavior is much less fixed and it moves around more. That makes sense to you, Mark?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. It's Latinos are the last group of real swing voters, and especially in Texas, where they're even when there's a party alignment, the partisanship's predictive value among Latino voters, even when you have partisanship, is less predictive than say among white and definitely among African American voters.
I would just add one more element.
Yeah, please do.
Beto's campaign in 2018 is kind of a benchmark against which we look, and he had virtually no South Texas game. I don't think that Tallarico is going to make that mistake. I think that he's got roots in South Texas. He's from Laredo, speaks Spanish. I think that there's going to be a full tilt effort from them recognizing the value of that swing vote, that South Texas swing vote.
I'm stretching to connect this to our discussion, but there's a question here that I think I can maybe stretch to connect, and that is, do you, I think from whatever perspective would note that part of Tallarico's perceived strength is that he's been a good fundraiser. Paxton has not been a prodigious fundraiser thus far. Do we expect that that's going to more or less equal out once national fundraising gets involved and now that the runoff is over?
I think so.
Blood for Growth will be funding Paxton. I don't think he can raise very much money personally. But
the super PAC money is going to come in and dwarf what the candidates have, at least in terms of TV advertising. That it's going to be national money coming in, primarily attacking Paxton on one side and attacking Tallarico on the other, and then the money for their campaigns is for the more positive and other walking around type things. But this will be, I think, the money will be spent disproportionately by super PACs simply because that's the way it works now. And especially, it's always, we always have to step back from Texas. We're such an expensive state to campaign in. 20 media markets, two in the top 10, and another two in the top 30. It's just the amount of money you need to do a statewide ad buy here is just extraordinary. Campaign, Maine, Maine is what, like would be the Maine is half of Austin, so
Right.
and Alaska is Midland, so it's it's just it's another world, and it's tough to raise that money with federal campaign limits. It's just there isn't enough money out there. But the super PAC money is effectively bottomless in this type of cycle, although not completely bottomless, in that one of the consequences of Paxton being the Republican nominee is they're going to have less money for some of their other races. And that was one of I think the big issues that motivated Majority Leader Thune and his fellow Republicans, was not only did they like John Cornyn, they believe John Cornyn was be the better candidate. They don't necessarily want Ken Paxton as a colleague, but also they would need, they're now going to need to spend a lot more money to bolster Paxton, which they probably would not have had to do if Cornyn was the nominee.
This kind of speaks to another question, or is reformulating a little bit another question in the chat, but you know, what is and I know how impossible this is to answer having been asked it, but what is the Trump factor between now and the general election? Do we expect Trump to do things to help Texas candidates, to hurt them? Is there any way of knowing that? I kind of think that's the actual answer, but weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly going to do something that affects it. Do any of us
He's
know
not
what that
very
is?
good
I
at
don't
doing
know.
nothing.
And there's a lot of time between now and then, and the environment is the reason Republicans are so spooked at the moment, and they should be. And I can tell you for a fact, all the consultants are. But the two things we don't know what's going to look like in September are, the Trump stuff, whether it's the Iran war, the ICE operations, that kind of thing, or the economy. And there's just simply no way to know. We're certainly at a point now where it's really bad for Republicans, and that's why everyone's so scared on the GOP side. But that things may change, or may change enough that the environment shifts far enough where it's blunted a bit, or it might get worse. Who the hell knows?
It's fascinating because, again, going back to 2018, I remember late in that cycle, Trump, I believe it was Houston. He had a visit to Houston, a rally in Houston, and a lot of the Republican candidates, especially those in the urban areas, their supporters is like, oh my God, does he really? We kind of like him, but does he really have to come now? I mean, this is not ideal. And of course, I remember talking to Pete Sessions, folks. He had the race against Colin Allred. There was attention to that rally, even though it was in Houston. And of course, that helped Allred and Lizzie Fletcher, who was running a congressional race there, and all of those judicial candidates that won in Harris County.
Gromer, I had this on my list and we're running out of time, but I want to ask you, I want to follow up on something that we talked about last time we were all together. And that is the friction that you were picking up in Dallas over the racial dynamics in the Tallarico, Crockett, Allred dust up. Now, 2 months later, Jasmine Crockett seems to have really raised her profile and sort of flexed some political muscle in helping with endorsements in a couple of those congressional races. Colin Allred beats Lizzie Fletcher. And one of the points you were making when we spoke last time is that there were still bruised feelings among Democrats in your region over the Allred Tallarico dust up. Allred is now a general election candidate. Jasmine Crockett is flexing muscle. Give us do you have a sense of what the state of that is? I think you ended that answer last time, if I remember, it was something like there were bruised feelings that were going to have to be addressed.
Yeah, and they
got an update on that?
And they still have to be addressed. If you notice, Jasmine Crockett has been really quiet about James Tallarico. I, it's amazing. I mean, it's been weeks now since March 3rd, and she still hasn't really said anything about him, made any attempts to embrace him. I know he's reached out to her a few times. That's going to take some time. Um, I suspect she'll say and do whatever the right thing is for Democrats, but I don't know that the enthusiasm will be there. We will see. And of course, Allred is now headed back to Congress after beating Julie Johnson. And that's going to be really interesting as well because Tallarico endorsed Julie Johnson in that congressional race. He says it was before Allred got into the race, but you know, it was interesting. He came to Dallas on her behalf, never mentioned her name, you know, posed for pictures and tried to make a point of saying, hey, later when folks asked his team about it, they tried to have us make sure to know that, yeah, he did this before Allred got into the race. So there's going to have to be a reckoning between Allred, Tallarico, Crockett, Tallarico. And in order for Tallarico to have his best chance of winning, he is going to have a maximum base turnout, and particularly with communities of color, because that's his sort of his weakness. He did well with Latino voters, but he's going to have to get them out. He's going to have to get Black voters out, Asian voters out. And in order to do that, you're going to have a united front. And that's the question. Can he heal those wounds? And will Trump, the anti-Trump vote, help him do that? It's
I want to give
fascinating.
you, before I throw it back to Tom, I want to give you each a quick, a quick 1 minute, what did you want to talk about we didn't get to? Harvey.
Oh, I just think the internal dynamics in the House right now, pretty much everybody believes that they're going to lose somewhere between 6 and 8. That creates the possibility for, well, Dustin Burrows, presuming he survives as Speaker, has decided to govern by caucus. And when those numbers shrink, that empowers people like Mitch Little inside the caucus to actually be shadow speakers. So,
Brad.
Looking at the Republican statewide ticket, it struck me how difficult unifying is going to be. I think they'll still probably end up doing it, but this whole slate, I mean, it's not just with Beau French and Dan Patrick, like all over the place. These elected officials have either publicly or privately been talking a lot of smack about each other, and that's never easy to get over for politicians who naturally have big egos. Dan Patrick still has not congratulated Beau French on winning the Railroad Commission seat. It doesn't matter ultimately, I don't know, but Democrats are very much united right now because they see an opportunity and they're all getting in line, maybe Jasmine Crockett notwithstanding. But does that have any effect on their ability to coordinate, the Republican ticket's ability to coordinate up and down the ballot? I don't know, it's TBD, but it was a funny observation for me, and just thinking
Yeah.
about all the inside stories I've heard about how much a lot of these guys really hate each other.
Well, we have two, very pro Dan Patrick former senators on the statewide ballot, right? Gromer?
I don't think Republicans will get the 5 congressional seats they want in redistricting. This will, if it's a wave year for Tallarico and Democrats, that'll make it a little difficult. But the process did wreak havoc in North Texas, where you saw Democratic incumbents, Mark Vesey, Julie Johnson, Jasmine Crockett, they are all out, leaving Congress. Allred is coming back, but there's a net loss in North Texas with 1 Democratic seat. And I'll end this by saying, if there is a big wave, they probably will wish that maybe a heavyweight had got in District 24 where Beth Van Dyne is. I'm not saying that she's at risk of losing, but that race will be interesting if there's a wave. I mean, she would have to really fight for it.
Mark?
I guess what I would think of, we've seen, we're at a point now, assuming that Donald Trump doesn't drag the Republican Party down further from where it already is, which is always a possibility. We're probably at a nadir for the Senate candidates, in that you had a very bloody primary where both candidates spent quite a bit of money on ads that seeped over outside of the Republican primary electorate into more of the general electorate than would normally be the case for a targeted primary campaign. Uh, so what I'm going to be interested in seeing is what happens to the Tallarico support once Republicans spend, between say 100 and 150 million dollars over the course of the next, 5 months, savaging him on taking every position that he's taken, statement he's made, thing that he's voted on that's well to the left of the average Texas voter, and magnifying it and essentially repeating it ad nauseum. Now, Democrats will also be able to do something similar with Ken Paxton for those voters who haven't been paying much attention, but that's a smaller share of people who are in that camp compared to the people who don't have solid positions on Tallarico. And I think it was mentioned before, Republicans remember getting burned by Beto because they didn't take him seriously. And by the time they actually did at the start of the fall, he had already established an image in the eyes of many voters as a post-partisan, pragmatist, moderate. They're not going to make that mistake again with Tallarico. And from a polling perspective, I'll be interested to see what happens to Tallarico's numbers as those negative attack ads sort of rain in on him.
And this very divisive runoff is now over finally, right? There's tons I want to add, but instead I'm going to try to do a service announcement before I throw it back to Tom, and that is,
let me say one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
One last thing. The last major Republican candidates, statewide candidates standing from 2002, Greg Abbott.
There you go. That's good. I just want to remind people that there are interns at UT and around the state looking for positions, looking for gigs for the summer and the fall. We have a bulletin board I just put in the chat. Please use it. Pass it on to people that you know are looking for interns. And with that, back to Tom Forbes. And thanks, guys. That was great, of course.
Thanks. Thanks very much to to Jim and our entire panel. This was a stimulating conversation, and we appreciate very much the participation by our audience and our great panel for joining us yet again. And it's always very enjoyable hour to spend with you all. As a reminder about today's program has been approved by the State Bar for those of you who are lawyers for CLE credit. We also hope that you'll join us for our next PAAT program on June the 17th. The title is The Business of Lobbying. That will be a two-part dive into tax planning and business structuring for government affairs professionals, and be led by the public accounting firm of Ashley and Associates, which is very experienced in this sort of work. There's more details on our website. Thanks again for your participation in PAAT programming generally and your continued support. Thanks again, too, for being a part of today's post-runoff power hour. And we hope that you have a great rest of your day and a happy weekend. Thanks again to all of you.
So long, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.